Welcome. Well, good morning, everybody. I'm really glad you're here, and I'm so honored to see so many people from so many different places in the world. I know that for a lot of you that aren't in the US right now, it's either morning or evening wherever you're at, and so we're very honored that you've taken the time to join us today. First off, to give you a quick sense of who we are, I know many of you probably know XPLANE, but for those of you that don't, we're a design consultancy. We're focused on change and transformation inside of organizations. How do we get people aligned, on board, and moving forward together? We've worked with more than a quarter of the Fortune 500, as well as within government, nonprofits, and organizations of all sizes across the globe. So this really gives us a unique perspective to understand what it is that makes the inside of organizations tick and how to help get people aligned and moving forward together. Most of our work is in helping companies bring their visions and strategies to life. We know that organizations are made up of people, so the solutions to do this must address the culture and the people within the company. We draw on the design toolkit to bridge this connection using human-centered design, co-creation, and visual thinking to activate strategies and transform how companies work. What we're going to share today is a practical approach for how you can do this in your own organization. This is very much a learning session. We want to be able to share some knowledge with you that you can put to work right away. So first, a quick primer on the theory behind the practice. As this is the second in a series of 2 webinars, I presume that nearly all of you have already viewed webinar 1, which laid out our point of view on why most companies don't succeed in doing this well. As a quick refresher, and for those who've not attended in the past webinars, let's do a quick summary of that content just to set the stage. First and foremost, we know these sad truths. Strategy is super expensive, and we also know that the majority of strategies fail. Over $38 billion is spent on strategy consulting every year, and that's strategy alone, not management consulting in general. Multiples of that are spent planning, executing, and reworking strategy when you add the internal time and expense within your company to make this happen. And we also know, and it's been measured and reported across multiple sightings, that over 80% plus or minus of these strategies are going to fail. Businesses are really great at planning, but we're not so great at doing. So my goal today is very simple. I'd like to share with you a system to help you become leaders of the 20% of companies that are successful. In our 25 years of working with the largest companies in the world, we've identified that there's a couple of key reasons that the best strategies are never realized. They boil down to basically 3 root causes. The first one, lack of line of sight between the people and the mission. Does every person in your organization understand how their role ladders up to your strategy, to your vision, to your purpose? For every person that doesn't see clearly what the connection is between the strategy or what you're asking them to do differently in their daily job, it's going to be increasingly challenging to get them aligned, on board, and moving forward together. The second fundamental reason that strategies fail is that we actually fail to invest in activating them. We've all seen the shelfware that the 3-year strategy in the binder ends up becoming when we toss it over the wall at a town hall meeting and maybe put it on the shelf. But if we don't actually invest at least a portion of the time that we spent developing that strategy, getting people to actually activate that strategy and bring it to life, the strategy is not going to come to life. So investing in activation is a key issue. And then lastly, lack of employee engagement is a big driver. And engagement happens on a lot of different levels. There's the engagement that comes from getting people involved in the development of the strategy and the tactics that gives them a sense of ownership. There's also the engagement in terms of how you roll it out and whether or not employees are brought on board in an active way that gets them thinking, touching, feeling, and experiencing the strategy and the new behaviors and the new ways of work. So we look at lack of engagement as a critical issue that we want to address today. So the biggest challenge, and the one that we are going to focus on today, is actually how to make the 80-20 rule work for you when it comes to the people in the organization. When we launch any new initiative, there's about 20% of the population that's usually on board. There's also about 20% of the population that are probably resistant to the change. They see it as risk, they don't understand why we're doing it, and they're recalcitrant about moving forward. Those aren't the people we want to focus on today. Today we want to focus on the people in the middle. These are our fence sitters. They determine whether our initiative will gain momentum and succeed or not. These are the folks that might be saying sure to our face, but underneath or quietly to themselves, they're saying, no way, I'm going to sit back and wait and see what happens. And for these people, oftentimes it's a function of needing to understand what it is, why we're doing it, and what the benefit is for them to make the change. While it may be hard to shift the 20% that are the naysayers, if we can get the 60% that are sitting on the fence into a good place, we're going to succeed with our initiative. We've now got 80% momentum in the organization. So our approach to tipping the scales is something that we call the activation curve. This is the framework that we're going to work from for the rest of today. It represents not only how people learn information, but also how they engage with it and hopefully advocate for it. In the first stage, with any new information, they hear it. This is the phase where they become aware of the change that's happening. Hopefully they're beginning to understand the what and the why of it. And our goal in this phase is to get them to the point where they're accepting the change and ready to at least be open and explore new ways of work. But to be successful, we also need to get people beyond that acceptance and help them believe it. Believing it is a learning phase. This is where people start to acquire new skills, new ways of working. They apply them in their daily job and their daily work, and they're starting to internalize and get feedback from those changes to see what's working, what's not, and whether this is something that should stick. And ultimately, real change isn't going to occur until they're living it. This is where we need to start embedding the experience. We need to go beyond just announcing our intentions and make very real investments in helping people not only hear it, but believe it and actually live it. This is where we're starting to see the behaviors that look like integration of these new ways of work as the new business as usual. This is when it becomes the way that the company now is. And that's when we know we can in fact start building upon that and looking into the future. If we do this well, we're going to overcome each of those three reasons that we started with today. Number one, we're going to connect each person to the strategy so they can see where they fit. Number two, we'll invest not only in launching the strategy, but in activating it by moving people up this activation curve. And number three, we want to do this in a way that engages employees to be an active part of the change process. So before we dive into the how of strategy activation, I'd love to understand where all of you are starting from. In your own company, if you're currently in the midst of a major change program, and I presume most of you here are dealing in change of some kind, I'd like to know where you would put your own company on the activation curve right now for an initiative that you're driving. So if you look on the poll, you should see a couple questions. I see a number of you are already starting to fill it in. Please just chart your own company on where you guys are on the activation curve as we just laid it out. Okay. So let's close the poll and we'll share this with you. This is actually great. This is actually pretty unusual. So we have a pretty advanced group here. Typically what we see is that the majority of folks are in the awareness or maybe tipping into the understanding stage. We see here today with this group, we've got a lot of folks that are actually already doing the applying work, which is fantastic. And I did look over the attendees that were going to be on this call today, and there's a lot of folks in the learning, the development, and the strategy background. So there's probably a lot of folks that are focusing on these problems. So I'm going to use this today to start to hone a little bit of where we can put skills, where we can put interventions at each of these stages to help support your efforts. I will call out that beyond applying, we've got a very, very, very small amount of respondents suggesting that they have reached those higher realms of the activation curve. So we'll talk about tools for all three of these levels, and we'll have a special focus on getting past that applying stage and up into the embed stage. So now let's dive in. Here's our goal today. Physically in front of you, this is the destination we want to get to. We want to make sure that you can actually develop this for yourself and build this into your own organization. We call this an activation plan. The activation plan considers the change that you're trying to lead, whether this be a new vision, a new strategy, maybe a process change in the organization, and combine it with what we know about how people adapt to change, resulting in a roadmap of activities that you can use to help get the entire organization where you need them to go. There are three key components to an activation plan. First, the key stakeholders. The biggest single mistake made in planning an activation campaign is the one-size-fits-all communication plan. We make the mistake of thinking that we can have one plan and it's going to reach everyone, when in reality, we need to understand that different stakeholders are in different places on the activation curve, and we need to adjust the messaging and the level of activities to meet them where they are. The second key component is the timeline. There are a number of existing milestones in the organization's lifestyle that we should consider, as well as some that we should create. All serve to define the boundaries of the activation plan. For example, an organization might be rebranding. There might be a sales summit or a scheduled town hall that already exists in the life cycle of the business. We want to know these things both so that we can take advantage of existing events in the corporate life cycle, as well as to build in the interventions in time to prepare the organization for something as public as a brand launch. And lastly, the third element, our activation plan contains the specific interventions or building blocks that will make up our campaign of communications, training, and activities. Each targeted at specific stakeholder groups, and each is timed to move them up the activation curve within the requirements of our known milestones. To design this correctly, we need to draw upon many of the skills that designers use to create the best outcomes. So we'll share a couple of the toolkits as background before we start diving into the work. First and foremost, empathy is our number one go-to tool. Remember the fence sitters that we talked about in a couple slides back? To move them, we need to understand them. What are they excited about? What do they fear? What risks do they see that if we don't address, will fail? And if we can address, we might get them over the fence. How is one group of employees doing this differently than another group? Empathy is the key tool for us to understand what we need to do and what the interventions need to be to get people from no to go. The second skill that we need to apply is research and observation. We need to understand the structural dynamics in the organization, from how the employees are distributed. Do we have a lot of employees in one office? Do we have a lot of folks in multiple offices around the world? Do we have a mix of people that are working from home versus working in an office? Two, on the other side, what are the existing communications? What's the training infrastructure? In essence, what's working for and against us in the context? We also don't need to reinvent the wheel sometimes. There are already things working in the organization that we can leverage for our activation plan, and if they exist, we want to identify them so that we can use them. And finally, we need to use even deeper anthropology and observation skills to uncover potential barriers to change. These could include elements of the company's culture, its organizational structure, its goals and incentive structure, or several other things. But collectively, we want to know the terrain ahead, know what the barriers are that are going to block us, and anticipate them in our plan. So to move to action, we want to share a simple approach to designing your own activation plan. There are a lot of tools that go into building a really robust activation plan, but we tried to boil them down today to a set of essentials that should go into every activation plan that gets built. The recipe for today is to do these 6 things. First, we want to give you some tools for basic stakeholder understanding. Second, we want to share a couple of tools for how to understand the organization and the terrain ahead. Third, we want to look at the barriers to change, the culture barriers that exist in the organization, and understand them so that we can actually plan for them. Third, we want to understand the roadmap of the life cycle of the company. What are those milestones that we talked about that we should take into account? And then we will begin to design the activation plan using a set of tools that we'll share, and then ultimately show you how we at XPLANE refine these plans before we finalize and launch them. So let's get to work. Each of you, we hope, has an initiative right now that you'd like to see executed successfully. I'm assuming that a lot of you are here because you are looking for some incremental tools to put in your toolkit as you do your day job and lead your organization to a new place. So if this is the case, please imagine your own initiative as we go through these exercises and be thinking about how they might apply to your particular circumstance. We will be sharing these tools with you after the webinar, by the way, so you'll be able to do this work for yourself as a next step. However, in order to see this at how this works as a common example, we're going to use a fictitious company for the rest of this session as today's case study. So we're going to call this company Paragon Games. This is a pretty common example of a mid-market organization. There's 3,500 employees in the organization. They're distributed across 21 offices worldwide, big concentration of folks in North America, Europe, and India, but they also have commercial offices in key markets around the world. There's a couple things that have changed in the organization, namely, they've recently gone public. They've also been beginning a process of growth through mergers and acquisitions. So there's 1,000 new employees that have recently joined through an acquisition. And they hired a top-tier strategy firm, Bain & Company, to finish their growth strategy, and they're about to launch it internally. So we're going to use them as our example so that we can see how these activities work in a case study. Again, think about your own organization as we go through. So our first task is to understand the primary stakeholder groups in our organizations and what role we need them to play. For this, we begin by brainstorming a list of 5 to 6 stakeholder groups. What are the groupings within our organization that might have common needs, wants, different points of view? Typically, each of these groups is at a different level of understanding and therefore at a different starting point on the activation curve. Once we've outlined these groups, we then do something we call the who, do, and 3 questions exercise, which is outlined here. We start with the fundamental question everyone asks: who is our target? Who are our stakeholder groups? Who are the people that we need to address? We then jump to the outcome we seek, and we start thinking about what is it that we need them to do. Do we have a different need for people managers, for instance, than we do for customers or partners? So what is the action that we want them to do? Do they need to advocate? Do they need to buy in? Do we need them to adopt a new behavior change? And then once we understand the who and the do for each of them, we start to ask ourselves, what are the key questions that we need to answer for these people so that they can actually move to action and get to that do stage? There's typically things that are obstacles in each of their paths to get them to take the action that we need for the strategy to be successful. Let's identify what those key questions are, because then we can start to build the answers into our campaign. So working with Paragon Games, we might develop a stakeholder analysis that looks something like this. We've identified that there's a couple of key groups. First and foremost, we need to talk to the executive leadership and board. We're really dependent on them being advocates for what we're doing and resourcing our initiatives. So we're going to have to answer a couple of key questions for them. They need to understand, will this strategy achieve our objectives? Is this the best investment of our resources? If we can do that, we're likely to get them on board. Secondly, people managers are critical. This company's highly distributed, it's pretty flat, and so the people managers are the connective tissue between the leadership of the company and the work that gets done. For these folks, it's really critical that the do is that they need to be engaged and they need to inspire their teams. So for them, we're going to answer some key questions like, what are we doing and why? How will you equip me to be successful? Or maybe, what's my role in this bigger organization? From a staff perspective, the key here is they need to understand, accept, and contribute. So for them, we're going to have to answer questions like, why is this better than the old way? The big one, what's in it for me? And because this is a really culture-bound organization, is our culture going to change as a result of all this growth? This is not a small question, by the way, as we'll see as we start to explore barriers. In this group, we also identified that the new employee group is a key stakeholder group. We know that not only is the organization growing quickly and bringing in a lot of new folks every day, but they are also doing M&A. So they're bringing in and merging with companies, which are giving big groups of new employees, like the 1,000 that just joined the company. In the future, maybe by the time the strategy is done, the culture of Paragon Games is going to be the culture of all the new employees. So we're going to make this a key focus area. With these folks, we want to make sure that we're integrating and aligning them quickly into Paragon and where we're headed. And they're probably wondering things like, is Paragon somewhere I want to work? Do they have a sound plan for the future? And do I fit here? These are people that are both joining the company voluntarily, as well as people that are maybe joining the company through a merger. And then lastly, Paragon is a very public and very transparent company, so their customers are a key part of their stakeholder group. They're contributing to ideas, they're contributing to feedback loops, they're contributing to product development. So we want our customers to be excited for the future. So we need to answer a couple of key questions for them. Are you still relevant? Will I get lost in the shuffle if this is a bigger company? And will Paragon continue to be innovative? Next, we want to begin understanding the context of our organization. Now that we know the people, we want to understand what the terrain looks like. There's many ways to understand, many things to understanding about the organization when activation planning, but the most fundamental is how do people get their information? We want to start to look at the grapevine in the organization and understand if there's stuff there that we can start to leverage. What are the formal communications? What are the informal communications? Are there environmental reminders in the organization that we can take advantage of? Maybe what are the unique rituals or the unique elements of this company that we would want to make sure to consider in our design? So whether through detailed observation or even with a quick post-up exercise like the one that's pictured on this slide, we want to document the communication channels that already exist in the organization. There's no reason to build something new if there's already something that's working well that we can take advantage of. So in this exercise with Paragon, we've done a quick brainstorm using sticky notes, asking them to give us some insight into what the most authentic ways they communicate are and what are the best possible channels that we could leverage. For Paragon, we've done the post-up exercise, we've mapped the answers into groups, and we've prioritized the most effective communication channels as follows. First, on the formal category, they already have an established tradition of using town hall meetings on a quarterly basis to give the entire company all staff updates. We'll definitely want to leverage that. They also are active users of the company intranet. Even though intranets have fallen in and out of favor as we've got more and more distributed workers, they become increasingly important in the future. So they're starting to be really strong users of the intranet. And then they also have a lot of almost daily team meetings. As an agile culture, the groups of people that are working together on projects are meeting almost daily. So we want to leverage that communication. In the informal category, they're big users of a social channel called Yammer. So we want to learn a little bit about how Yammer works and figure out how we might be able to leverage that in an authentic way. We also know that a lot of the informal questions happen in one-on-ones with managers. So we want to equip managers with the answers to be prepared to answer those questions. And then lastly, peer-to-peer groups are a principal way that people learn information. People are asking people on the project teams, what's going on? What do they know? What do they think? So we want to be mindful that that is happening in the culture. In the environmental category, if you walk around the offices of Paragon, you're going to see that they use video monitors everywhere, communicating messages of what's happening in the company. They're big users of posters and swag. They also love having their messaging appear on things that they give out at company events, distribute as gifts, etc. So it's an area we could consider. And then lastly, some things that are unique to Paragon. They have an entryway brand wall in every one of their offices that becomes an opportunity both to communicate with employees as they come in the office, as well as customers and outside partners and visitors. We also know that onboarding is really critical for this group. They've built up a lot of onboarding tools because they are bringing in so many new employees so quickly. We don't want to miss that opportunity. So then, having identified what those channels are, the other fundamental thing that we want to understand about the organization is what are the barriers that might exist on our change effort? As we look forward into the organization, what are the obstacles that are between us and our destination? There's many, many ways to uncover this information. Research, interviews, observation. They're all legit ways to do it. They're all valuable. But most oftentimes when we're doing strategy activation work, what we find is that we're time bound and we're resource bound. So we've come up with some rapid approaches to replicate a large research study by using a simple discovery tool like a card sort exercise. Card sorts allow people to quickly select traits that are present in the organization from those that aren't, and can be combined to create a quick picture of the organization's culture, attitudes, and beliefs. You can create your own using index cards. I'm actually working on a project right now that we're delivering next week, and I'm building a prototype card sort exercise using standard index cards. So you can make your own, you can use some that already exist, there's many out there. Today, we'll use a set of cards that we've produced called discovery cards. These cards will help us to understand challenges and opportunities in the culture today at Paragon. They're sorted into 4 categories: growth challenges, culture challenges, potential crisis issues, and possible solutions. We ask each participant to sort the cards into hits and misses. Hits are issues that feel familiar, and misses are not necessarily present in the organization. Then, with all the hits, we ask the participant to identify the top 5 to 7 issues and tell us the story behind their selections. Storytelling is a great tool to start to uncover insights, and listening closely to not only what cards they choose, but how they tell the story will give us real insights into where we're headed and what the barriers are ahead of us. In this case, the folks at Paragon Games shared the following. Paragon has been growing rapidly, and the recent IPO and acquisition of smaller competitor has pushed us into an internal crisis mode. We've got too much to do in too little time. We're not aligned about the priorities, so no one knows what to focus on. As a result, we're spinning our wheels with endless discussion, but we're not getting anything done. So with these issues in mind, we then ask the participants to pick up the solution cards and sort them into hits and misses. The recommendation that emerges from this card sort looks like this. We have a great history of innovation here at Paragon, and we love the company's purpose and values. We want to preserve the core. That said, times have changed, and we need to help our employees navigate our new environment. We need to set a course for our future, prioritize our strategic initiatives, develop people to be able to meet the new requirements of those strategies so that we can once again empower employees to take initiative so we can unleash the kind of innovation that made us famous. Now, with this very brief exercise, we've got some real gold to work with. You can imagine that to get the same kind of insights, it might take 20, 30, 40 interviews across the company, but we can manage to do an exercise like this and pull up some really interesting information very quickly. Without this knowledge, the introduction of the new strategy could have been disastrous. Employees were already feeling overwhelmed and in crisis mode. Tossing another strategy over the wall would have maybe put them over the edge. But with this knowledge, we can introduce the strategy in a way that acknowledges the realities at Paragon and positions the strategy as the solution that they wish to see. With Paragon, we did this exercise across members of each stakeholder group just to ensure that we had the insights right. And the pattern that emerged validated our initial assumptions. As we looked across all of the stakeholder groups, we started to see that the same issues came up, maybe at a different level, but collectively, we have a picture of now what the organization as a whole is feeling. This type of exercise can be scaled from one person to hundreds and reveals patterns much more quickly than many traditional interview-based approaches. So let's take a quick break here. I want to get you guys engaged in a poll one more time. Having done this for Paragon, I'd like to turn the lens back to your needs for a second. As a quick pulse check on the type of challenges you're facing today in your organizations, let's take a minute to see which of the following culture challenges are most threatening to your own change initiative if you're running one today. Please take a look at the choices and let us know which one resonates for you. Okay, so let's publish this. So lack of alignment is the #1 issue folks have. This is very common. If we kind of go back to where we started, that line of sight issue is so critical. And we often overlook the fact, even when we launch a strategy, that maybe we haven't aligned people's incentives or their individual goals or made relevant to them why we're doing this. So lack of alignment is absolutely one of the key focus areas that strategy activation is designed for. Likewise, living in the past, I'm just going to comment is, unfortunately, this is a human condition. Change is hard. And so to get people to move from the way we used to do things to the way that we're going to do things in the future really requires touching on activation and making people be empathetic to why it is that they are resistant to change, and then help them see why the future that we're painting is a better future. So we'll talk a little bit more about how to intervene against these things. Let's return now back to the Paragon story. So sometimes, as you can imagine, as we've just done with this, these answers are going to lead to additional questions. Living in the past, for example, I'd want to start to understand, well, what is it that we want to preserve about the past versus what are the things that maybe we can let go? And why are people resistant to change? Depending on what we learn in our initial research, we might want to add additional exercises to generate deeper insights into these kinds of questions. In the case of Paragon, we wanted to understand what might help us promote the strategy versus what might hinder us. Again, people are feeling overwhelmed. We need to make sure that as we launch the strategy, we're actually reflecting back to people our understanding and empathy for how they're feeling and present this as a solution. So while we won't go through this exercise in detail, we're pretty short on time today. I do want to just give you a quick highlight of what this card sort exercise could reveal for Paragon Games. With Paragon, we used a deck called the Barriers to Change cards. And what's different about this deck than the Discovery cards is that this is actually very specifically asking people questions around how they feel about the new strategy and what the obstacles are. So we would address this to a group of people that were maybe involved in the strategy development process. Maybe the folks that partnered with the strategy firm that developed the strategy, maybe folks in the leadership team, and then some samples of folks from different groups that have varying degrees of understanding of what the strategy is. Just like in the earlier card sort exercise, we sorted potential challenges, this time specific to the strategy, into hits and misses. Those that participated, while considering the impact that the new strategy might have on the organization, revealed a few additional critical things. People at Paragon aren't opposed to a new strategy. They just need to see enough detail to be confident in it. Their confidence was the key issue underlying their concern. Also, secondly, we learned that incentives are a key engagement issue for folks at Paragon. And if we don't align the incentives at the point we launch the strategy, we're going to create conflict in people's minds in terms of what they think they're being rewarded to do and what we're asking of them. And then lastly, we surfaced that people don't feel that they have all the needed skills. We need to invest in skill building and capability building in order to remove this obstacle, because it's actually one root of their fear around the unknown path before them. If we can take this away, the unknown isn't as scary. So to bring all of this together from this section of work, the discovery that we've done on barriers feeds into both the plan we're about to develop, as well as the messaging we use throughout the process. From our town hall script to our onboarding and training materials, we want to make sure that we keep these issues front and foremost in our mind. One best practice we always do at this stage is to develop a content and messaging brief like the one pictured here. It summarizes the key themes that we want to address throughout the length of the activation program, and we're actually going to be using this over the course of the next year with Paragon. So the last thing we want to discover before designing the plan are the milestones on our path that are already fixed. What are the scheduled events, the driving deadlines, and other constraints that would help shape the cadence of our plan? For instance, for Paragon, we learned that there's a board briefing and a town hall to launch the strategy that's already on the calendar right at the beginning of the year. Recalling the activation curve, this is then going to mark the beginning of our awareness phase. We also know that the global sales meeting is going to come next, and we plan to launch our branding publicly and hold our annual customer conference thereafter. Given these events will require our team to be publicly fluent in the new direction, we want to begin our learning phase prior to this, so our people feel prepared and they're equipped to actually meet the needs of questions from the public. We can take advantage of the global sales meeting as a kickoff for this. And finally, by the time we get to 2021 planning and year-end reviews and goal setting, we need to have successfully embedded the new strategy as our new normal. This sets the required finish line for our embed and live it phases. Now we can get down to the planning exercise. We'll start by building the frame, which is defined by the stakeholder groups and the timeline and milestones. For Paragon, it looks something like this. We see our stakeholder groups that we identified in the prior exercise on the y-axis, and the timeline and the key milestones that we just identified along the x-axis. This starts to frame up the overall activation plan's boundaries. Now, given everything we know, we need to add the right building blocks to actually navigate us down the route. Over the years, we've captured a number of interventions that work well for specific activation goals. We call these building blocks. In the kit that we're going to send you right after this webinar, you'll have both the worksheet that you see here in the photograph, as well as the individual cards that we've used in this exercise, so you can do it yourself and hopefully apply it in your own organization. Here's how it works. People learn in different ways, so a hybrid program that addresses many different learning styles is going to be the most effective. Again, remember, one size does not fit all, either in communications or in how people learn. You can see that we have suggestions for tools that fit lots of different objectives. For instance, personally, I'm an introvert. I tend to hear information, but then go home and do a lot of research, a lot of reading, and explore individually so that I can understand it. In the bottom left, you see we've got a couple of suggested interventions that will help people interact and explore individually. Likewise, for extroverts, we've created a number of interventions that could be used to explore with others and learn as a group. There's a number of ideas of ways that we can share the story. How do you actually get this information out in multiple touch points into the organization in a broadcast manner? We know that co-creation is powerful and that oftentimes the best way to get people engaged is to get them involved in shaping a solution. So we have a couple of ideas for you to get people involved in actually putting their fingerprints on the solution and contributing their ideas. Likewise, we want to make sure that people can personalize the story. Remember that one of the key things is getting people to have line of sight into how they fit. So there's some tools that will actually help them see where they fit into the broader picture, as well as some tools for daily work that'll help equip them with the skills, the behaviors, or the support that they need to actually do things differently. And then finally, over to the right on this worksheet, you'll see that there's a lot of tools that we have to keep the momentum going, embed the solutions, and actually maintain and celebrate the victories. So there's tools for tracking progress, tools for staying motivated, ways to keep maintaining and celebrating the victories, and ways to just keep the initiative top of mind throughout the year. Lastly, in the bottom, flipping learners to teachers is something that we see as a best practice. Anytime that we can actually get people to learn information and then share it and teach others, those folks are in the process of doing that, actively moving up the activation curve. So here's how the exercise is going to work, and hopefully you'll be doing this yourself for your organization. We've placed each of the building blocks on a card. You can array the cards out by category. So each of the categories we just looked at the worksheet, for instance. And then we suggest in this case that you choose at least 2 from each category, ensuring that we have a combination of activities that meet many types of learning needs. Just like in the other card sort exercises, we sort the piles into hits and misses. With this exercise, we want to consider not only what intervention most meets the need, but also which is going to feel the most authentic in your organization. While a hackathon, for instance, might be a great co-creation event to run in a tech company, it might feel out of place if you're a bank or a financial institution, and you might want to choose a different way of work for that. So we do encourage people to look at these with an eye towards what's authentic at my company and pick things that are going to resonate and feel natural. There's no reason to actually make the learning harder than it needs to be. In this case, we've selected 6 hear it phase activities, 8 believe it phase activities, and 6 live it phase activities. A great start. You'll notice also that these cards, when you actually sort them out, are color coded to the activation curve. So the cards in the lowest level on the bottom left are all activities that we would do in the awareness phase versus in the learning, believing, and living and embedding phases. So we are starting to see also visually that we're starting to shape this into a campaign that is comprehensive. And as we'll see in our last step, refine, as you flip these cards over, it will also reveal which barriers to change each of these interventions will best serve to mitigate. We can use this as a check in our last step. So now, with our draft plan built, we have one last step to take, refine. In the refine step, we want to look back over the work we've done and make sure we've covered all of our bases. In particular, we want to know if we've addressed each key stakeholder group and their unique needs. For example, which of these activities will address the customer communications or the communications to new employees? And we also want to know if we have a way to address the major issues and barriers that we identified. For instance, have we included elements that are going to address the perceived need for new skill building? Are there enough job tools, job aids, training, et cetera, in our plan to actually meet what we've highlighted as one of the major issues? And from the poll, you've highlighted as one of the biggest challenges you've got internally. How do we actually get people into that sort of applying and learning phase successfully? By reviewing the stakeholder analysis, the barriers to change work, and the interventions that we've chosen, we can add and subtract building blocks until all of our bases are covered. And for Paragon, it's going to look something like this. This is the activation plan that we developed as a result of the work with Paragon. We see our stakeholder groups on the y-axis and the timeline and key milestones along the x-axis. We've added a set of 6 activities to drive awareness. In the Believe It phase, we've invested more. Like a lot of you in the poll who are at that application phase, we've put in 10 activities, including some critical training and onboarding to address both skills development and the integration of the new employees that are coming in, both as new hires, as well as the ones that are joining as a result of mergers and acquisitions. And then we planned 5 activities to help embed the changes, maintain the momentum, and celebrate our success. Together, these activities will serve to help move each employee at Paragon up the activation curve, accelerating adoption and the successful execution of their business strategy. This is where we're hoping that each of you at the end of this webinar are going to be able to develop and get to in terms of a plan for your own organization using the tools that we'll provide. But hopefully this gives you an illustration of what it looks like in a case like Paragon. Now, of course, it's our hope that you'll be able to do this in your own company and that the tools that we share can be put to use right away. I'd love to hear your first impressions about which of these tools we learned about will be most useful to you. So let's open up our last poll of the day and just answer for us which of the tools we learned about will most positively impact your own efforts. As a reminder, we learned about 5 core areas. Number 1, the Who, Do, and 3 Questions worksheet, which is a tool to actually start to understand who are our stakeholders and what are their motivations. Second, we looked at a communications audit worksheet to understand what's the context of the organization, how do they learn information, and how can we take advantage of that. We looked at 2 different card sort exercises to start to reveal and research what's underlying in terms of barriers and obstacles and going on in the culture. We looked at the activation building blocks, which is a collection of best practices that you could apply. And then we looked at the activation framework that can be used to put it all together. Let's take a look at how you guys are feeling about each of these tools. Okay, great. So let's close the poll. This is great. Ultimately, I think people see generally that they can apply most of these tools in lots of different ways. Activation plan framework, bringing it all together, seems to be the most popular choice. So I'm glad to hear that. It's obviously cumulative, so pleased to see the pretty equal distribution between these tools. And let's see, as we look forward to the card sort exercises, and we didn't spend as much time on barriers to change, even though that was very popular. So I think the key lesson there is sometimes we need to dig deeper and do the exercise twice. So I'm glad that you see the value in that. We've also got a couple of questions starting to come in. So we're going to address those in a second. The reason I wanted to do this poll, just in conclusion, is that we're always building these tools, and it's XPLANE's policy to try to share them with the world. We do a lot of great work with our clients in client engagements, but we also, part of our purpose is to put some of this thinking out in the world to empower other change makers to grow and change and make an impact. So we really appreciate your feedback. We're always working on new tools for use in our own practice and to share with the world through Studio X. So your feedback's actually helping to guide our efforts. Looks like we have a few questions left, a few minutes left rather, for some of these questions that are coming in. So in addition to the ones that have already been shared, if you have additional questions, please open the Q&A tab and type one in. We're going to address the ones that are in the chat already, but if you use the Q&A tab, there's a nice feature that allows you, if you see that someone else has already typed a similar question, to vote for it, and it'll rise to the top. So let's start with a question from Paula. With a geographically distributed team, what is the best way to virtually mimic the posted activity? That's a great question. We're seeing a lot more meetings that are happening in distributed ways, online, using WebEx, using Zoom, using other platforms. We've found actually there are some great tech tools. And one of the tools that we use at XPLANE is a company called Mural. Mural has a wonderful technology to do post-up exercises in a distributed way. So I might check them out. We've also found that if you, absent using a technology solution like that, actually just even in a web conference, if we open up Zoom or we open up a WebEx chat panel, for instance, we assign one scribe to actually capture the Post-it notes that are coming in through the chat feature and then include them on the wall. So putting a human in the process between the whiteboard, the chat window, can start to replicate a Post-it exercise. Let's see some other questions. What is the average time frame to apply the tools to empathize, catalog, and research? It's a really good question. So if I'm reading that correctly, how long does it really take to do what we did here in 40 minutes? We've done it in as little as 2 or 3 days. I don't recommend that necessarily, but it can be done very quickly. I'm a great believer in the 80-20 rule. You're going to get 80% of the answer in about 20% of the time, and then any additional time that you spend is going to refine that work. So I'd say that you can do a 1 to 2 day workshop with a client who's already gone through strategic planning, assuming it's done, and then do a follow-up to do some of the research with the key stakeholder groups. And those can be done as individual interviews. They can be done as Zoom meetings. And collectively, within a week, you can get probably to the 80% good enough answer. And then everything after that is refinement. But using these tools, they're designed really to expedite the process and make it such that you can get a really good solution in a shorter time frame, which frankly is because a lot of companies are not yet ready to invest in activation. So out of necessity, we've tried to design these tools to work very quickly so that we can overcome the obstacle of you don't have budget for that, you don't have time to do the research. Using these tools, hopefully you can do enough research to get to a good solution very quickly and overcome the budget hurdles that often exist. Another question that's come in, what techniques do you apply to understand people's fears, concerns, and desires? Is deep interview one of them? I think related to my last comment, if you've got the resources to do deep interviews, then absolutely take advantage. There's so much color that comes from interviews that we can't learn from a simple card sort exercise. We often use card sort exercises really to start to show us the tips of the icebergs. But once we know that, for instance, I'll give you an example. In one client, we did a card sort exercise with the leadership team, and one of the cards that was pulled was top-down culture. And right there in front of the CEO, they were talking about, which is really powerful. So a card sort is a great way to actually surface the icebergs. But that led us to then create another line of inquiry to say, well, let's really unpack and understand, what do we mean by that? What are the challenges of the top-down culture? How does that manifest in the organization? And to get to that, we actually did individual interviews with each of the key stakeholders in the room to really understand the material underneath it. So I'd say letting them work as a system is powerful, but using something like a card sort exercise helps you learn where to focus so that you're not spending a lot of time wasting research hours on areas that are non-starters. I'm going to take this last question before we get to the close, from Bettina. That's a tough one. How do we help new leaders really understand that they need to do this work? The simplest answer I can offer is that we need to get these leaders to co-create the process and take this journey with us. So to the question of how long does this work take? While the first week or two of designing the solution might be enough for us to understand what needs to happen, to really make it successful, we want to find the ways to bring those leaders, particularly the reluctant ones, into the process. For example, you may get them involved in doing some of the survey work and the empathy exercises to actually understand what their stakeholder group is feeling. We did this with one very reluctant customer who really felt in their organization that everybody was on board and aligned. And by having them go out and do the research exercise over the course of 2 or 3 days with their team, using an exercise that we designed, they came back actually as zealots for the project because they really saw firsthand with their own eyes how big a gap there was in the organization and how many blind spots there were. So co-creation is a really powerful tool, and one that we would use in the case of trying to flip the people that are maybe not on board into being not only on board, but advocates for the solution by getting them involved in actually the process of discovery and the design of the solution. So co-creation would be my #1 go-to on that. So with that, I think we're at the top of the hour. I want to thank you for the great questions and for your feedback. We've got a lot of other questions in here that we didn't get to in the time. So we're going to use those as input to some of the blog posts that we're going to create, some of the dialogue that we're going to share in terms of trying to shape these. And if you didn't get a question answered that you really want to get answered, please reach out to me directly. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me at XPLANE, and I'm happy to continue these dialogues and conversations. I hope that this information is going to help you and find it useful in your own work. In terms of the next steps, we're going to be sending out copies of the tools and templates that we use today to each of you by email. For more information on our work, our thought leadership, or our downloadable tools, please visit our website. We've got a lot of stuff there that's free and downloadable, ranging from templates and tools to exercises. We also have tools, including our card decks, that are available in the store. Lastly, we'd love to get your feedback and ideas. Every time we share something, we learn even more in return as you guys use it. And as a community, we're building some great tools for change. So I love the fact that you guys are giving us feedback today. We're going to absolutely embed that into the work we do going forward. And I'd love to make this an ongoing dialogue with each of you. So in closing, thank you. We're very grateful for the time you shared with us today, and we hope to keep the conversation going. I wish you the best of luck in whatever change you're making in the world, and we hope you have a great weekend. Thanks again.